Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tim Kais, and welcome to God Save the King. And if you happen to be watching this on video, you can tell by my background here that I'm not in my usual location today. I'm in a secret, undisclosed location doing the show today. Hope you're having a great day. Glad you're with us. And we're going to talk about some interesting things today. Had a lot of really interesting plans for the show this week that got kind of thrown a curve at the last minute. So I do happen to be out of town. I was having some really great conversations with some friends. So that's what we're going to talk about today is a bunch of miscellaneous stuff that we're going to kind of throw out on the table. And that's really interesting because we were just having a lot of fun chatting about God Save the King, about what my new discoveries have been and things like that. So, but before we get into that, as usual, you are listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern time. And if you appreciate content like this, we would appreciate it if you would let us know, if you would follow and like and subscribe to the TBTRN YouTube page, to my YouTube page, to Facebook. It's, all the social media, etc. Your likes, your follows, your subscriptions, they definitely help us out. So we really appreciate that if you appreciate the content that we give you. And there's a bunch of great shows on the Truth Be Told radio network. So I highly encourage you to check out those shows as well. And there's a wide variety of ways that you can listen to the Truth Be Told radio network if you have a smart device. So whether you've got, a Google, an Apple, or an Amazon home device, you can program your home device to just simply say, hey, play TBTRN, play Truth Be Told radio network, and on it will come. And then ironically, your cell phone is also a smart device. Many of them have the exact same, applications in them that the home devices do. So you can set up your cell phone that if you want to listen to the Truth Be Told radio network, and there's a variety of applications that you can download that will help you do that. But the Truth Be Told radio network, their website is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. And then my website is God Save the King, www.godsavetheking.org. So once again, please follow, like, and subscribe to our websites and our social media, because that definitely helps us out. So like I said, I'm actually out of town, and that's why I am broadcasting from a remote location today. And like I said, we had some plans for what we were going to do today, and they got kind of thrown a little bit of curve at the last second. And but I've been having some really great conversations with some friends locally here, and that's why we do want to, pardon me here, I got a scratchy nose for those of you on video, talk about some interesting things today. We were frankly having a meal last night, and my friends turned to me and they said, well, so what's new? In other words, what are your new discoveries for God Save the King? And for those of you that have not heard my show before, what God Save the King is God Save the King is my ongoing over 30-year research project into what the nativity really would have looked like. And I don't want to do the background again on this show. I do it often enough. It plays a critical component in the story of how God Save the King developed, because I was introduced to the theory that Jesus was not born on December 25th, 35 years ago. And what happened is that initially my assumption, and the assumption of many others like me who were introduced to that hypothesis back then, is that we assumed that the date changed, but the story didn't really change. And by the story, I mean the traditional nativity story. Joseph and Mary, the back of a donkey, no room in the local motel, so they stay in the stable behind the inn, and Mary gives birth on a cold winter's night, and there's animals around and all this stuff. And that's what we call the traditional nativity story. And that, of course, with certain variations, is what most of us were raised on. And like I said, when I was introduced to the theory that Jesus was not born on December 25th, the initial assumption was that, oh yeah, the date changed, but the story didn't change. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Because number one, there's two different factors that factor into why, yes, the story is actually very different. Okay. Number one is the fact that the traditional nativity story can be traced to extra biblical sources that can then be verified as being completely false. Okay, that's rough. That's a rough one to hear, because certain and well, let's just go there for a second. I do talk about it in other shows, trying real hard not to repeat myself extensively here, but let's go there for a second. The primary sources for the traditional nativity story are what are known as the infancy gospels. Now, not infancy narrative, okay? The infancy narratives, you've got two infancy narratives in the Bible itself. You've got an infancy narrative in Luke, and you've got an infancy narrative in Matthew. And it's the first two chapters, essentially, of each of those two gospels. And that's what we have. We've got a whopping 4 chapters that tell us about the birth of Jesus Christ in the Bible. Okay. Now, ironically, there's other topics of discussion in the Christian world that have even less than that, right? They don't even have 4 chapters. They've got even less, but that's what we have in the Bible. And those are referred to as the infancy narratives in the Bible. But then in addition to that, we have what are called infancy gospels. Now, the infancy gospels are apocryphal works. They're apocryphal. They are not part of the canon of the Bible. They're rejected as being part of the canon of the Bible, and frankly, for really good reason. Okay, they're not reliable. And I know that is a common question that I get asked a lot as part of God Save the King. And also, it's a very common question among skeptics. Okay, now I'm not prepared to dive into it in super detail today, but let me give you some broad stroke understanding about how and why the canon of the Bible as it is really mostly very, very, very reliable. It's there. Yeah, there's a couple questions, but they're small. They're small questions. This notion that is very popular, like it was, okay, let's go there. Okay. So let me tell you a story. So I was on a missions trip. Wow. 20 plus years ago. I was on a missions trip and to India, and I was flying from Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C. to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow on to the Indian subcontinent. And a very good friend of mine, Nick Laram, pastor of Maranatha Church in Virginia Beach, gave me a book that I don't remember the title of. All I remember is that it was about the Knights Templar. And we're both history geeks, so this was a great book for me to read, and really had a lot of fun reading it. And I burned it down. I read the entire book on the flight from Dulles to Heathrow. And I was so enthralled by it. And during my reading, I realized, oh, this author is British. There's really no question that the author is British. And I was like, wow, well, if he wrote about this, what are the chances that he wrote something else, right? That along the same lines that I would find equally as interesting. So of course I'm landing in London in Heathrow Airport. So I, go to the bookstore in the airport, and sure enough, there is a whole section of books, not only by this author, but by similar authors on similar subjects. Okay. So I'm perusing the different books there, and I picked up this book called The Templar Revelation. And I forget who the author is. I'm sorry, I'm on a remote location, so I can't go to my bookshelf behind me and tell you the name of the author because I've forgotten, and this was 20 plus years ago. But it was called The Templar Revelation. I flipped it open, and I read the first couple of pages to see whether this would be something I would want to buy and read for my flight, to I forget where, Trivandrum or Bombay, Madras, wherever. And so Chennai likely. And so I buy this book and I start reading it. And this book, here you go. This book is about how the secret knowledge from the Knights Templar was also encoded in the artworks of Leonardo da Vinci. Sound familiar? Okay. Now, this was before Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, came out. Okay. So this was clearly one of the source books that Dan was reading. As a matter of fact, when I did research into the Da Vinci Code later on, I actually verified the fact that this was one of the source books that Dan Brown was reading. So the irony is that he and I were probably reading the same book at the same time about the same subject, and then lo and behold, the Da Vinci Code came out a few weeks later, right? Okay. Well, at any rate, the Da Vinci Code is very famous for promoting what is known as the Magdalene heresy. Now, the Magdalene heresy has been around a while. Dan Brown did not discover it, and the guy who wrote this book on the Templar Revelation, he didn't discover it either. This has been around for a long, long time. And as a matter of fact, I won't go there, but that's what the whole mythology of the quote unquote Holy Grail, okay, is based upon a pun. Pardon me, I have to clear my throat. The whole mythology of the Holy Grail is based upon a pun in Latin. And I forget which one is which, but if I'm wrong, you just got to flip it. There's two phrases in Latin. One is San Grail, Sangraal, right? San Grail. And then the other one is Sang, Sang, Rail, Real, right? San Grail and Sang Rail, right? But obviously you should say either of those quickly, you get San Grail, right? There you go. So there's the pun. Now it's a pun in Latin. And the interesting part of it is that one of those means, I think it's Sang Rail, means royal blood. And then San Grail means holy cup, right? So this whole mythology behind the Holy Grail, the cup supposedly used at the Last Supper, and the relic worship that goes with it, is a cover story for the Magdalene heresy. The search for the Holy Grail is the search for the Magdalene heresy, this supposed royal bloodline that descended from Jesus of Nazareth, who, according to the heresy, married Mary Magdalene and had children, and then Jesus mysteriously disappears, and then she moves to what would now be the south of France, and then this bloodline permeates the royal bloodlines of Europe and supposedly exists to this day. Now, I'm not supporting that theory at all, not at all, but there are people who believe it, right? Now, all of that to say this: a lot of people, based upon the information in the Da Vinci Code and other works of that nature, make a very common claim about the canon of Scripture. Now, I am not claiming that the canon of Scripture that was agreed upon, in the 4th century is perfect, okay? But neither is this ridiculous claim that most people make that, oh yeah, they deliberately eliminated certain books because they knew what it said and they knew that the truth was in these books, and that therefore they're going to make sure that those books are absolutely not included in the canon of the Scripture because, oh, we can't have them mean what we think they mean or what they claim they mean. But that claim is patently ridiculous, okay? It simply is not true. Doesn't mean that the canon of Scripture is perfect, but that is an outrageous claim that really has almost no foundation in real factual knowledge, okay? Because as I've talked about on other shows and in my television show, when it comes to the historicity and the authenticity of any ancient document, they are all adjudicated, they are all critiqued by the same criteria, okay? So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a quote-unquote secular book or a supposedly holy book. They are critiqued according to the same criteria to verify, to determine and to verify whether they are something you want to pay attention to or not. So this is part of the process that would have gone into the canon of the scripture, the canonizing of the scripture, deciding which books should be allowed in, and frankly, which books shouldn't. So let's talk about some examples here, okay? Now, please forgive me. Like I said, I'm recording in a remote location, so I don't have my notes in front of me, so I can't give you hard data straight from my notes and give you hyper accurate numbers, but the principle remains the same. I'm doing this from memory, and I'll throw some numbers out there, and they may not be hyper precise, but you'll get the idea, right? So let's talk about the criteria that are used to adjudicate ancient documents. So let's talk about ancient documents, because so we could be talking about any of the books that we do find in the canon of the Bible, right? So let's just pick the Gospel of Matthew, for example. Let's critique that, and let's find out certain things about the Gospel of Matthew. But then at the same time, let's talk about the Gospel of Thomas, okay? Because the Gospel of Thomas is one of the apocryphal works that was determined to not be valid enough to make it into the canon of Scripture. And we'll talk about why in a second. So let's compare the Gospel of Matthew with the Gospel of Thomas. Now, those are two purportedly holy books, quote unquote. They claim divine inspiration. So let's compare that to a book or two that doesn't necessarily claim divine inspiration. Let's talk about Julius Caesar's commentaries on the wars of Gaul. So when Julius, and this is relevant because, Julius Caesar is not directly involved in the story of God Save the King, but he is absolutely indirectly involved, no question about it. Because we were having great fun last night over dinner talking about this, the fact that you've got legions that were recruited by Julius Caesar during his wars in Gaul, right? So he takes his legions to go fight in what would now be considered northern Italy or southern France, Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul, etc. But his legions get depleted. He's got to recruit replacements and new legions from that area, right? So he recruited at least 2 legions from that area. Now, we know what happens in history. Caesar wraps up his wars in Gaul, and then he returns to Rome, right? But see, he's been writing back to Rome. He's been sending letters to Rome. And a lot of these letters were then compiled into a book that is now called the Commentaries on the Wars of Gaul. But he's writing letters back to Rome to tell the Roman people about what he's doing and things like that. And see, it's common knowledge that the Roman people loved Julius Caesar, because even though he was of this elevated rank in their society, he was extremely popular with the commoners because they loved the plebs, because they loved the victories he was winning for the empire in Gaul and making foreign kings bow down to him and things like that, right? So real quick on why it's relevant. So Pompey is back in Rome, right, trying to run the empire, and Caesar is off, winning glory for himself and everything like that. And he's writing these letters back, and everybody loves Caesar. And they, the Senate picked up on the fact that Caesar's kind of setting himself up to be king, right? And this is the Roman Republic. This isn't the Roman Empire yet. This is the Roman Republic, and this is a big part of why the history of Rome is important, is that they had made decisions hundreds of years ago to no longer have a king and to have a Senate that, quote unquote, represents the people, right? That you don't have a monarch on the throne, because a monarch will rule according to what he wants done and not necessarily for the benefit of the people, right? So now here's Julius Caesar making motions that look like he might set himself up to be king, right? Well, they don't like that, so they demand his resignation. They demand that he disband his legions, stuff like that. Caesar does none of that, and he marches back to Italy. The famous phrase crossing the Rubicon, is when his legions crossed the Rubicon River in northern Italy, because you didn't bring your legions to Italy, right? That's not how it worked. That's not how it worked in the Roman Republic. You didn't bring your army onto Italian soil, right? You left your armies in the foreign countries that you had conquered, and then you take them other places to fight more wars, right? So Caesar and Pompey go to war, right? And Caesar wins. Okay. Then Caesar gets assassinated, and then Caesar's allies, Marcus Antonius and Octavian, they go to war with Caesar's assassins. But at least two of the legions that were now under the control of Marcus Antonius were these legions that Caesar had recruited in Gaul, right? So now they've gone from Gaul to Italy, and now the battle they fight against Brutus and Cassius takes place in Greece. They're in Greece. Then you've got Mark Antony and Octavian go at it. These same legions are involved in the Battle of Actium, and they're under Antony's control in Roman Syria. Okay, so these are the legions that would have been in the region that also would have been loaned to Herod when Herod the Great had to retake Judea from the Parthians. See, so Julius Caesar is connected to all this indirectly. Plus, you have the allegiances of the Hasmoneans and then Herod himself to Julius Caesar, right? And then Pompey, then Julius Caesar, right? Because the first allegiance that was made to Pompey, and then there was allegiance made to Julius Caesar, and then allegiance made to Mark Antony, and all this stuff. And that's another reason why this show is called God Save the King, which, as I have mentioned many, many times, is the real Game of Thrones, because that's exactly what you've got going on here. Is you've got multiple challenges for multiple thrones all throughout the Mediterranean around the time of the birth of Christ, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So that's really the king we're focused on here, God Save the King. But at any rate, so that's a very quick little bit about the history and why Julius Caesar is indirectly involved in the story, right? But let's go back to these letters, this book that he wrote while in Gaul and writing back to Rome, right? Because what he's doing is he's writing letters back to Rome, talking about his victories and making foreign kings bow down to him and stuff like that, right? It is widely recognized by experts in Roman history that enormous portions of these letters were straight up propaganda, okay? So in other words, they were not factual reports of what was really going on. It was Julius Caesar writing to Rome and writing to Roman citizens and telling them what he wanted them to hear, right? And hopefully what they wanted to hear to make himself rich and famous and popular and powerful in Rome, okay? Propaganda, right? So simply because a book is labeled secular, quote unquote, and not divinely inspired like the scriptures, that doesn't guarantee anything, right? That doesn't guarantee a darn thing, okay? The author could be lying through their teeth. And if this is what's going on here with Julius Caesar and it's propaganda, quote unquote, right? Well, you got a problem, right? Then you also have this factor, which is something else people don't consider very often, right? Julius Caesar believed in the Roman pantheon. He was a quote unquote religious man, but nothing even remotely in the sense that we would recognize. We're not talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't know that God at all, to the best of our knowledge, at all. Okay. I'm not even sure other than being aware that there was this nation at the east end of the Mediterranean called, Judea, right? And I'm sure he was aware of the Hasmoneans and stuff like that in their religion, but he was aware of the Jewish religion, I'm sure. But did he in any way, shape, or form really know anything about Yahweh, about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Probably not, right? Other than the awareness of the Jewish religion that it existed, right? But he was a believer in the Roman pantheon, which means I don't know which Roman gods he prayed to, other than Mars, most likely, and Jupiter, right? Mars, of course, being the god of war. But he would have performed blood sacrifice to the Roman gods, for crying out loud. We know that when Octavian and Marcus Antonius, by the way, trivia, I try to say Marcus Antonius because that would have been his Roman name. Mark Antony, obviously, is the anglicized version. We have Julius. We have Shakespeare to thank for that. Okay? We have Shakespeare to thank for that. So he's the one that labeled Marcus Antonius Mark Antony, right? Okay. So I try to say Marcus Antonius because that would have been his real Roman name, not his anglicized name. But at any rate, we do know that Marcus Antonius and Octavian Caesar, right? When the Senate agreed to appoint Herod, the king of Judea, they marched with Herod arm in arm through Rome to the temple of Jupiter to offer blood sacrifice to Jupiter to install Herod. Okay? So the whole reason I bring this up is there's a little bit of more historical background to God Save the King, helps put it in perspective, but it also goes directly to the question that we're talking about, which is, okay, let's go all the way back to the historicity and the authenticity of scriptural documents. Okay? Because like I said, these documents are all adjudicated according to the same criteria. Okay? So what are those criteria? That's what's important. So once again, so it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Homer's Iliad, whether you're talking about Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul, whether you're talking about the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Thomas, we're going to judge all of them the same because that's the only real way to do it. That's the only real way to do it. You can't treat some with a different set of criteria. I remember a different conversation with someone, probably 5-6 years ago now, but it's just stamped in my mind is this vivid impression that we were having a conversation about a very similar subject. And he looks at me and he goes, well, but I just really think that any book that claims to be from the Bible needs to be judged with harsher criticism. And I'm like, why? Why is that? Please explain to me why the Bible needs to be judged with harsher criticism than Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul. And he says, well, because it claims to be written by God. And I'm going, really? Have you ever thought about Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul for a second? That here is a devout man. He believes he's a devout man. But what he believes is far wackier than what Jews and Christians believe. Okay, I'm sorry. The Roman pantheon, that's Looney Tune stuff. To pray to that pantheon and offer blood sacrifice. Okay, so I'm sorry. Why? Maybe that should be judged according to the higher criteria, right? But the obvious and correct answer is that to judge either one with a more strict criteria, that is what is known as bias. Okay? And when you're doing research, bias doesn't have any place. That's the whole point. The whole point is to do unbiased research. So therefore, you develop a set of criteria that applies to everything equally, and you look at that and you use that to determine, okay, is this book reliable, or is it propaganda, right? Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about the criteria that are used to critique ancient documents. Okay, so criteria number one is how long after the dates in question were the documents written, because here's a point you have to factor in. Paper existed, but paper at that time was made from materials that would decay and corrupt. So when it comes to quote unquote originals, we have virtually no copies of originals that we can verify. We may have some scraps here and there, and you'll notice that I said we may have some scraps here and there, but we don't know for sure, right? So if you're talking about the original documents, the original letters written by Julius Caesar that were then sent by courier to Rome, those are long gone. They do not exist. Same with Homer's Iliad, right? Same with the Gospel of Matthew, same with the Gospel of Thomas, right? The originals are long gone, okay? Now, like I said, we may have a scrap or two here or there. I'm aware of the Gospel of Matthew in particular that they found a couple of scraps, little scraps like this big, right? That they're going, wow, it's possible. We don't know for sure, but it's possible. Based upon dating and things like that and where it was found and that kind of stuff, that, wow, you might actually possibly have a scrap of the original. Don't know for sure. Possible. But for the vast majority of ancient documents, having the original that's a question that's already resolved. We don't, right? The only times we have originals, quote unquote, is when they were etched into metal, right? Etched into metal or etched into stone. So if you've got a clay tablet, or you've got a stone monument, or you've got a metal scroll or cylinder, right? Now those, okay, there we've got originals. But if the original was written on paper, now you've got a problem, because like I said, paper back then was made of natural materials, papyrus and other things, and it decayed and went away, right? So what we do have are manuscripts, right? And manuscript, it's an English word, but it's derived from root words that mean to copy by hand. Manual, hand copied, manuscripts, right? So a manuscript is a handmade copy that was written later on, okay? So that directly relates to this first question. How long after the events in question is the document from, right? Now, the document may be a copy of the original, yet nonetheless, how long after the original was this copy made? Because there's a huge difference between, oh yeah, this was a copy that was made 10 years later, and a copy that was made 50 years later, or a copy that was made 100 years later, or a copy that was made 1,000 years later. Okay, that's enormous difference. Okay, so that's very important. That is criteria number one, is how long after either the original was written, and or how long after the events in question was the document written. 10 years, 50, 100, 200, 500, 1,000. Makes a big difference, right? Question number two is, how many copies do we have? Okay, because if you've got 10 copies, that's a lot better than one. If you've got 50, that's better than 10, etc. 100 is better than 50, 1,000 is better than 100. Okay, the more copies you have, the greater the veracity of the document. Okay, especially because that leads us to criteria number three, which criteria number three is then, how well do the multiple copies match up with each other? Because if you've got, because let's talk about extremes here. If you've only got a small number of documents, 3 or 5 or 10, and then there is significant disagreement within the documents as you compare them one to another, you've got a problem. So you've got a document here that you can't put much weight in at all, frankly. You've got a real problem there. But if you go to the other end of the spectrum is, what if you have hundreds or even thousands of documents, and when you compare them, they add up extremely well. They compare extremely well. Virtually no errors, or a very limited number of errors, right? That's exactly that. That's the whole other end of the spectrum. Now you're able to say, oh yeah, this document here, yeah, we have 1,000 copies of it. Yeah, they're from between 100 and 300 years after the fact, right? And they cross-reference each other extraordinarily well. And if that's the case, you've got an extremely reliable document. So you know where this is headed. Let's go there, right? Homer's Iliad, if I remember correctly. The earliest manuscripts, in other words, the closest manuscripts to the date of when it was written are from about 900 years later, if I remember right. Okay, you can look it up. You can verify this. And by the way, please look it up and verify. Okay, I will gladly correct myself on camera if I am so far wrong that it needs to be corrected. I will do it. Like I said earlier, I don't have my notes in front of me, so the numbers are going to be generally correct. They may not be hyper specific, right? But the point here is that I'm after legitimate research here. I'm not after bias. All right. I want legitimate research, right? So Homer's Iliad, the closest one is like 900 years later. And if I remember properly, I think we've got like 500 or 600 copies of that. So that's considered pretty darn strong, right? Really strong evidence, right? 900 years, 500-600 copies. Wow, that's really strong. Now, I might be wrong on that number there. I'm pretty sure the 900 years is accurate. Off the top of my head, my 500 to 600 might be off. I might be unfortunately substituting a different document in my thinking, right? But that's Homer's Iliad. I'm aware of the fact that Homer's Iliad is considered pretty good documentation, pretty good documentary evidence. But then let's talk about Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul. Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul, again, the dating, if I'm not mistaken, is in that same ballpark. 700, 800, 900 years afterwards is when we have our earliest copy, right? But the number is very different. The number is only like 10 or 20. So it's a much smaller number. And yet at the same time, we don't really doubt what was written in Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul. We don't really doubt the text, so to speak, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've come to understand that a lot of it is probably propaganda, but as far as the text is concerned, and we compare the documents one with each other, they line up pretty well and tell us what Caesar wrote. Now, what we think about what Caesar wrote, that's another question, but it appears that we have a relatively accurate representation of what Caesar said, okay? But then you get to the Bible, right? Now, the Bible, here you go, and this is why people don't like it. And this is why what I started with all the way back at the very beginning of the show, that's why this is so important, okay, is because the Bible has extraordinary documentary evidence. The number of documents is in the thousands, not in the hundreds, not in the tens, thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. And these exist in private letters. They exist in manuscript copies. They exist in all different forms of communication. I would have to verify this to make sure, but I have heard, okay, that we can reconstruct the entire New Testament simply from private letters from one person to another, that we have enough ancient documents recovered from person to person that quote enough scripture and quote it accurately that you can reassemble the entire New Testament simply from private letters, let alone from manuscript copies that were caretaken by, monks or something like that, which that's a whole nother, realm of information there. So the number of documents is in the thousands, right? The dating, the dating is from as little as 50 years after the fact up to about 300 years after the fact, because here you go, back to the very beginning of the show. These are the documents that were used to determine the canon of the scripture. Okay? So if you've got thousands of documents between 50 and 300 years after the fact, you've got a gold mine, and a high producing gold mine at that, not just some thin little vein that's only producing a little bit of flake. You're tapping into a full on vein of ore, okay, that you can tap into here. And then the final number, of course, is how well do they line up with each other? And the answer, of course, is they line up extraordinarily well, okay, because a lot of the clerics who were in charge of doing these hand copies, these manuscript copies, they knew what they were doing, and they knew what they were being entrusted with. So they were very meticulous in making sure these copies were accurate. For one thing, they're handwritten. This isn't a word processor. You can't edit it after the fact. You've got to painstakingly hand copy every letter, right? Some ancient documents, now this is a little different. This is the Greek Masoretic text. But the Greek Masoretic text, the scribe would actually count up the number of times the certain words and letters were used on a given page, and then they would write that around the perimeter of the page and say, oh yeah, the letter Aleph is used this many times, okay, the letter, etc., and off they go. See, and that was to ensure accuracy. That's to ensure accuracy. So the point being here is that when you use these criteria, these three criteria, how long after the fact, number of copies, and then cross-referencing the copies with each other, the Bible in general and the New Testament in particular is a gold mine. We have extraordinary documentary evidence. Okay, extraordinary documentary evidence. But when you compare that to Homer's Iliad, for example, or Julius Caesar's Wars of Gaul, those are still considered valid. We don't have any real reason to doubt them being accurate. But the extraordinary difference in the numbers is stunning. It's beyond stunning. And then when you bring in this factor, and this is the factor that's unfortunately kind of unpleasant, is the fact that when you look at these gospels, a lot of these apocryphal works, the dating after the fact is 300 years, 400 years. Okay, now that's not horrible when you consider that Homer and Caesar are like 900 years, but it's 300, 400, 500 years after the fact, right? And then number of copies, 1, 2, 5, right? Some of these it's 1. I'm sorry, 1. Okay, that's a real problem. It's a real problem. And then comparison-wise, well, if you've only got 1, wow, that's brutal. That's absolutely brutal. Okay, and then there's an added factor. There's 2 different categories of ancient document related to the Bible. one called pseudepigrapha and the other called apocrypha. And once again, I don't have my notes in front of me, so I don't have it memorized exactly which one is which. But one of the two means that the claimed author is they use a name that they claim to either be or have been in touch with a critical figure in the Bible story. Okay. So, like, for example, the Gospel of Thomas. The reason it's called the Gospel of Thomas is because the author is claiming to either have been Thomas the Apostle, okay, or very closely in contact with him, right? Now, I am not super up on the Gospel of Thomas. That's not one I've looked at in a while. It's been 20 years since I did my Da Vinci Code research, so I don't necessarily have it memorized. But if I do remember correctly, the Gospel of Thomas is from about 300 years later. So in other words, so we can see, here's the other thing. We can use documentary evidence. We can use the style of writing, the text. We can use the language used and things like that, in addition to where was it found and this kind of stuff, that we can determine when the document was actually written. So therefore, even though the document may claim to be an eyewitness account of something that happened during Jesus' earthly ministry, we can go, nope, sorry. This baby was written in 200 or 300 or 500 or 700 AD, because we can tell by the style of language that was used. Sorry, proved you wrong. Boom, right there like that. So, like I said, it's been a minute since I've done the Gospel of Thomas, but if I remember correctly, there's one copy, and it's from about 300 years after the fact. So that means now this isn't bias. Now what we've done is we've used these criteria to go, ooh, you know what? We got to be really, really careful with this one. We can't run around making outrageous claims about this or that or the other doctrine based upon the Gospel of Thomas, because we don't have any proof. Now, is it true? Well, maybe it is, but there's no way we don't have the evidence to demonstrate that it is. It might be, but we don't know. We do not have the evidence. Now, if you have evidence to the contrary, okay, that says something different, and in that category, you've got the truckload. Again, now you've got a problem, right? So part of the Magdalene heresy that was such a big deal, right? The reason the Magdalene heresy was so inflammatory is because it claimed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, right? And one of the pieces of evidence that they try to do that with is the Gospel of Thomas, which says that Jesus used to kiss Mary Magdalene on the lips. Okay. And the problem is, and this I do have, I'll put it on my website, or I'll reference it next show when I go home and find it in my notes. I have a photograph of the only copy of Thomas that we have, okay, in whichever museum it is around the world. And when you read that line, Jesus used to kiss Mary Magdalene on the hole in the document, the word isn't there. Okay, it's literally missing, physically missing. So whoever tries to claim that is making it up. They're making it up. Did it say that? Maybe, but we don't know. So if you've got one document from 300 years after the fact, and there's a hole in the document at the critical point that you're trying to claim, you've got a real problem, a real huge, gigantic problem, especially when you have thousands of documents that never say Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, and it makes no sense. Okay? If you understand the scope of marriage in the Bible, which that is, 2 or 3 hour-long segments to explain the scope of marriage in the Bible, okay? And the whole concept of the bride of Yahweh and then the bride of Christ is encoded in this whole thing that we call marriage. Okay. Jesus wasn't married. Sorry, guys. He wasn't. Okay. Now, all of that to say this, we went on one great big, huge, giant bunny trail, but we are back. We are back to the Proto-Evangelium of James, because the Proto-Evangelium of James is a document that teaches us about the about Mary, the life of Mary, supposedly, because it's junk. Okay, it is 100% pure junk. Okay, supposedly teaches us about the life of Mary and then about her marriage to Joseph and the nativity. And I've talked about it in other segments of the show. You can find that if you want a more in-depth examination of the text of the Proto-Evangelium of James. But in light of what we're talking about today, let's go over the criteria, like we said, right? Let's go over the criteria. Well, number one, it claims to be written by James, the brother of Jesus. And it was not. Absolutely not. No question. Slam dunk. Absolutely not written by James. So you got a problem there, because now whoever did write it was willing to falsify, claiming to be the brother of James to try to give this document credibility. So that is an enormous problem. That throws the entire document into question immediately. Because if he's willing to falsify that, what else is he willing to falsify? Okay. How far after the fact? 200 years. All right. 200 years. Because the document, we know the Proto-Evangelium of James, because of the language used in the document, right? Like I said, analyzing the text and saying, well, they didn't use this kind of language at this time in this location. We know it was written between 150 and 250 years after the birth of Christ. So I just picked the medium and I say 200, right? 150 to 200 years after, right? So right around 200 AD was when the Proto-Evangelium of James was written. So if the other criteria were good, that would be very insightful. Only 200 years. Wow, that's pretty darn good, actually. But the problem is, how many number of copies do we have? Now, I'll be blunt. I don't know. Okay. I don't know how many copies we have of that one. That I would have to dig into and research and find out. But I can pretty much guarantee you the number is very small. The number is very small, right? And then you've got the actual contents itself and how it lines up, number one, with other copies of the same document, but then also with other documents that talk about the same subject, right? Because interestingly enough, I just used the example of the Gospel of Thomas, because it talks about whether or not Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married or not. Okay. Well, gee, guess what? The Proto-Evangelium of James tells us an awful lot about how, quote unquote, Joseph and Mary were married and what their marriage looked like. And it's lies. It's lies on top of lies on top of lies. That is not how a Jewish marriage looked. Somebody is making this up because they want it to sound a certain way. And that's not how it would have happened. So you've got a document a couple hundred years after the fact. It doesn't use the right language. It repeatedly betrays the fact that whoever did write it was not Jewish in their own background, and they were never around Jews. Okay. Because if they would have been, then they would have known that certain features like this couldn't go down that way. They wouldn't happen that way. Plus, they'd never been to the Bible lands. Whoever wrote this had never been to Jerusalem or Bethlehem, because they give a geographical description of it that's inaccurate. Okay, so we've got a problem there as well. So, but the bottom line is that these infancy gospels, the Proto-Evangelium of James in particular, are doubtful in the extreme. Okay. And that's me being polite to say it's doubtful, right? That's me saying that maybe there's the possibility that some stray fact might be accurate, but even that is really, really stretching it, because there are facts in that document that don't contribute directly to the nativity at all, and they're wrong. Okay. So if even the facts that don't matter are wrong, what does that tell you about the facts that do matter? Right? What does that tell you about the facts that do matter? Okay, so that's, interestingly enough, that really wasn't where I was planning on going today, but I'm glad we did. I had a lot of fun doing it. I hope you had a lot of fun listening to it, because those are important things when we look at the documentary evidence and the scriptural evidence behind not only God Save the King and the Nativity, but frankly, the entire scripture, and why it is that we as followers of Christ believe what we believe. All right. So it really matters when it comes to God Save the King. So my name is Tim Kise. My show is called God Save the King. You can listen to me every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told radio network. I hope you check in with me again. God Save the King.